Hello, welcome back. And in this video lecture, we're going to be covering some more topics, specifically as relates to hospitals. We'll cover such things as medical staff, talk more about profit versus nonprofit, and other topics. We touched a little bit about profit versus nonprofit, and there's some important distinctions here. With for-profit hospitals, they're typically privately owned. They might be owned by a corporation like HCC, Humana, Tenet, and others. The excess income is distributed to shareholders and owners just as any other business. Proprietary hospitals are for-profit and they're owned by corporations. They could be owned by Humana, Tenet, HCA, or some of the bigger ones. They could be owned with a partnership, right? So a physicians group in other states may be allowed to own hospitals. And then they're also owned for-profit hospitals that are owned by a private foundation, right? And we see a lot of those around. With a not-for-profit hospital, the excess income is invested into the facility. Government-supported hospitals or public hospitals are not for profit. These are what we call in California general hospitals, county medical centers, things like that. So any excess income gets reinvested back into the hospital. The Department of Veteran Affairs, the VA hospitals, are also examples of nonprofit. And then there are other voluntary not-for-profit hospitals. These are such things like St. Jude's, Shriners, and what have you. A term that we sometimes hear about are things called teaching hospitals. Teaching hospitals can be either not-for-profit or for-profit or voluntary nonprofit, but they have to be affiliated with an accredited medical school and they support residence fellowships and other medical training beyond medical school. Most healthcare facilities are organized like any other typical corporation. So we have narrow leadership with a big span of authority spanning out. And some members of the organization include the governing board, which basically has total responsibility and accountability for a hospital, the administration, the medical staff, the chief executive officers, the different services, committees, and contracted services. You can see over here, we have the governing board, and then we have the administration, and then somewhere in here we have the CEO, the chief executive officer, that's responsible for carrying out the wishes of the board with the medical staff, the physicians who have privileges, clinical privileges that we'll talk about later. And then we have the different diagnostic, therapeutic, plant and operations, as they're sometimes called, facility operations, and general services. And health information falls under that. We support the whole hospital in administrative capacity. The governing board, typically the members serve without pay and they're represented by professionals from the community. It has the ultimate legal authority and responsibility for the hospital's operation. They pick a chief executive officer. They approve the chief financial officer. They're responsible for hospital organization management, the mission, the vision, the control, the operations, and appointing the medical staff. The administration is basically the go-between, if you will, between the medical staff and the governing board. So they're basically responsible for developing a strategic plan for supporting the mission and goals of the organization as communicated by the governing board. And this includes, like any other organization, the chief executive officer, a chief financial officer, a chief information officer, and a chief operating officer. And then on the right, we see the medical staff. This is consist of licensed physicians and other licensed in-scope providers like nurse practitioners, PAs, that are granted clinical privileges. Clinical privileges are basically what the medical staff is allowed to do. Just because somebody has a medical degree, if they're not a surgeon, they can't do surgery. They have to work within their scope of practice. The governing board delegates authority and responsibility to maintain proper standards of medical care and to vet medical staff applicants. And like the hospital itself, the medical staff is organized into clinical departments and specialties. And most medical staff members are required to serve on committees. As you can see some of these in table 1.7 in your book and 1.6. Now, just because somebody is given clinical privileges doesn't mean they can do anything without restriction, even in their scope of practice. We have different categories. We have active, we have associate, we have consulting, we have courtesy and honorary, right? So active is what we think of your typical medical staff physician. Consulting might be some specialist that comes in on some very rare disease or condition. And courtesy would be somebody who's, say, allowed to admit patients because it's somebody that they're following for a long time. They allow them to admit and follow a patient as a courtesy. And honorary or retired or semi-retired medical staff members. Sometimes you see these people on medical staff libraries or medical libraries, or they work in hospital health education or what have you. And again, two tables you'll definitely want to be familiar with are 1.8 and 1.7. These talk about hospital committees. Typically, these are multidisciplinary, like the Health Information Management Committee, for instance, the Infectious Disease Infection Control Committee are some examples. And then we have other committees, lab, HIM, the hospital committees, if you will. And again, quality patient care depends on coordinating all these different disciplines into one standardized practice, right? That's why we have the committee and department structure. And again, if we have committees, we have to have committee meetings, and committee members are expected to be active and participate, take meeting minutes, have an agenda, record meeting minutes, and so on, like any other normal business practice. And here's our last set of quiz questions. Who holds the ultimate legal authority in a hospital? Is it hospital administration? Is it the governing board, the medical staff, or the risk management department? Next question, which category of medical staff only admits occasional patients? Is it active, associate, consulting, or courtesy? And then last question, what is the function of utilization management in a hospital? Is it to plan community programs? Is it to ensure appropriate and effective use of services? Is it to regulate licensure of providers? Or is it to supervise medical students? Take a moment and ponder these questions, and then we'll get to the answers on the next slide. And of course, the governing board is the ultimate authority in any hospital. Courtesy staff are the ones who occasionally admit patients, and then utilization management ensures appropriate and efficient use of services. Sorry about that. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online. Bye now.